War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 57, Taming the West. When I was in Afghanistan, there was quite the international flavor with no small amount of British officers, dare I say English, who were all too happy to impart their magnificent knowledge of counter-insurgency on the ignorant Yanks. To which I finally replied in exasperation, I am an American citizen because you sucked at it, and the American Indians live in Oklahoma because it turns out we are pretty good at it. Quite frankly, the tactics and even strategy of counterinsurgency are quite simple, by the simple fact that the insurgent is almost universally far weaker militarily than the counter-insurgent. Going back to the Prussian prophet Clausewitz, he who is so derided as ignorant of those wars on the fringes, provides the basis for all conflict to include counterinsurgency. His first commandment might well be, and I quote, "The best strategy is always to be very strong, first in general, and then at the decisive point." The counterinsurgent should almost invariably be the stronger power, and yet the failure to defeat often rests upon his other observation that, in war, more than anywhere else, things do not turn out as we expect. Perseverance in the chosen course is the essential counterweight. So why would the weaker power persevere over the stronger? We must, again quoting to learn, to first regard a war and the separate campaigns of which it is composed as a chain of linked engagements, each leading to the next, but instead succumb to the idea that the capture of certain geographical points or the seizure of undefended provinces are of value in themselves. We are liable to regard them as windfall profits. I can attest to the idea that each individual action in Afghanistan served as an objective in and of itself, with no seeming linkage to a victory. We sought to exhaust an enemy who could reclaim their physical and moral energy in safe havens we dare not invade, returning again if the objective is to mass force against an enemy's center of gravity, while establishing we never shall. How can one reign victorious? And yet another observation. The aim of war should be the defeat of the enemy. But what constitutes defeat? The conquest of his whole territory is not always necessary, and total occupation of his territory may not be enough. There was no inch of land in Afghanistan that I would not enter with merely a platoon strength of American infantry. We controlled, in theory, the territory as scribbled by the Russians and British, while forgetting we were fighting Pashtuns, who recognized no border. In finality, the ultimate test will lean on one last quote. The more powerful and inspiring the motives for war, the closer will war approach in its abstract concept. The less intense the motives, the less will the military element's natural tendency to violence coincide with political directives. As war is policy achieved by military means, understanding that basic tools of negotiation lend heavily into the strategic calculus, and the moral motivation, that great force multiplier, 3-to-1 if Napoleon is to be believed, is the ultimate foundation, and thus a counterinsurgency will always be defined as whether either party can walk away or not. In negotiating terms, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement or BATNA. When your enemy can walk away, you have a massive advantage, and that is the ultimate calculation. One of the failures, in my opinion, of Hamas's current strategy is they think the Jews will walk away from Israel. This underlying assumption drives all insurgency calculation. On Israel's part, they acknowledge that an Islamist-driven insurgent will not abandon the fight, hence their insistence upon the destruction of Hamas. The variable there is whether the Arabs in Gaza will continue to support Hamas's objectives. Israel's successful peace overtures to Jordan and Egypt indicate that, while the people may not want peace with Israel, some Arab leaders realize peace is preferable to conflict. So what does this have to do with the American-Indian wars? Quite simply, the European settlers were not going to walk away. In fact, one of the things working against the Indians was their flexibility on land. Especially after the Civil War, the Indians of the Great Plains were largely nomadic. This was an operational and tactical advantage, but strategically a weakness. because they had no land they were willing to die over. And eventually, as they fled and retreated, they ran out of any land. Had they established cities and towns, these would have been strong points to defend and claim territory. In their absence, they strategically continued to walk away, and as they did so, they encouraged more settler expansion. One of the key differences between the Anglo-based and Spanish-French and European-based colonialism is that the Anglo-based had no interest in subjugating and enslaving the native populations. They merely wanted their land, whereas the continental-based settlers were far more interested religiously and economically in incorporating the native populations into their colonial settlements, which is why intermixing between Spanish and native populations was so common, but rare among Anglo and native populations. Because of this, once the Indians had fled an area, there was no further conflict in that area, and the Indians continued to lose ground. It is also why the more sedentary tribes were the earliest to succumb to European settler encroachment, and the more nomadic plains Indians remained the most recalcitrant. Also, the plains constituted the least desirable land for settlement and agriculture. As with all insurgencies, the war was one of mobility. The Plains Indians, despite horses being an European introduction, used their horses to great effect. The U.S. Army, realizing the inherent requirement for at least equal mobility, mostly used cavalry and mounted infantry during these campaigns, establishing forts across the plains. A quick point of differentiation between cavalry and mounted infantry. Cavalry fights mounted, and mounted infantry uses horses to gain a mobility advantage, but dismounts to fight. And that being said, both were capable of fighting mounted and dismounted, and frankly, the difference was really just one of historical lineage rather than actual differentiation. Once the railroads began to crisscross the nation shortly after the Civil War, the logistics for the Americans became far easier. Now settlers were firmly established on both coasts and squeezing the remaining free tribes. While the use of concentration camps to denude the battlefield of supporting civilians and remove support for the insurgency is credited for first use to the Spanish in Cuba and famously by the British against the Boer, it was the American reservations that used the same strategy first in subduing the Native Americans. I would like to tell you there are some unique lessons to be learned from the successful counterinsurgency against the American Indians, but after 1 year of this podcast and analyzing at least half a dozen different insurgencies, wars of secession, and guerrilla campaigns, the lessons are simple and universal. As there is an inherent discrepancy in strength, by definition, asymmetric, the battle is not one of seizing territory but of violence and attrition, of momentary advantage of combat power at various points gained through mobility. And here mobility can be described as speed, but from the insurgent viewpoint, it can be anything that allows them to move with impunity. Often this can be by blending in with the civilian population. If the strategy mirrors that of the Arabs in Algeria and Gaza, this gives a twofold advantage. First, you have the requisite mobility to mask the temporary combat power advantage. And second, any endangerment of the civilian population benefits the revolutionary power, as this supplies informational ammunition, regardless of the fact that the illegal, at least by the laws of war, use of civilian shields and lack of a uniform, dead civilians, regardless of side, is an advantage. In the Indian Wars, the disregard of the Americans to the casualties of native populations nullified this tactic. In fact, it was ultimately the sensitivity of the Indians to the suffering of their non-combatants that ultimately cost them their sovereignty. Aware of this, while the U.S. Army would certainly engage any warriors they came across, it was the capture and confinement of the women, children, and elderly that brought the warriors to the table to sue for peace. The second battle is for refuge on both sides. We speak of bases and lines of communication in all combat, but it is these wars of mobility where such concepts of forward lines of troops, or flots, a modern term for the front lines, loses all meaning. So both insurgent and counterinsurgent bases are at risk, though, especially in the modern era, the counterinsurgent's advantage in firepower generally provides all but the smallest bases near invulnerability. The insurgent's base must be in one of two places, if not both. First is the external base, rendered sacrosanct by whatever limitations are placed against the counterinsurgents. This can be by politics or by simple geography. In modern times, with helicopters, the former is far more prevalent than the latter. The use of North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia for the Viet Cong and later the North Vietnamese Army provided the key advantage. As long as we confined our box to South Vietnam, while the communists had more room to maneuver, all our money, troops, and technology were ultimately irrelevant. In Afghanistan, Pakistan and Iran provided this refuge. In earlier times, desert swamps and mountains would grind down a conventional force facing a foe who was raised in such challenging terrain. Unquestionably, the harsh deserts of the Great Basin and Mojave and Sonoran deserts provided a great refuge for the Indians. The expanses and rocky terrain of the Dakotas likewise. But the harsh winters of the northern Sioux and Cheyenne made their civilians far more dependent upon winter camps, and here they were forced to relinquish their all-so-critical mobility. The second refuge, should your enemy place protection upon the civilian population as a prerequisite, is the civilian population. The use of a civilian population as a military base and shield is, of course, a war crime, but so too is sedition and secession. So now it's whether you can handle the pressure, both internal and international, by deliberately placing civilians in harm's way. Returning to Mao, the guerrilla swims among the civilian population like a fish in the sea. To this, the counterinsurgent is left with two choices. You can drain the sea through such tactics as concentration camps or reservations, or you can poison the sea. Here's where the trite and failed hearts and minds is generated. We are never going to make the Pashtun population abandon the Taliban for the Kabul-based Karzai regime and its forced progressive westernization. Likewise, the Dakota Sioux would not ally with the Crow, never mind the Americans. You will not get a Muslim population to abandon an Islamic insurgency in support of an American-installed government. It was possible to convert a population away from communism. As the inherent failures of the system were easy to articulate, it must be remembered in Vietnam it wasn't a communist insurgency, but a foreign communist mechanized invasion that eventually defeated the South Vietnamese government. The British in Malaysia were one of the rare examples of this tactic working. To get someone to abandon the materialistic ideology of communism is easy, however, compared to getting someone to abandon their faith. The use of a strategy developed to defeat communism cannot be so easily applied to a religiously motivated insurgency, a fact our secular society seems to have difficulty in accepting. The other option is collective punishment, to make the difficulty in supporting the insurgency so onerous as to poison the sea instead of simply converting it. The Nazis did this directly and without any compunction towards international norms. Arguably, the Israelis are doing this now in Gaza. However, as Hamas continues to use the civilian population in Gaza as their shield, this remains legal, though admittedly, as noted, onerous. As long as the international community, which provides the requisite support to Hamas, allows them to use civilian populations as their protection without sanction, then, to borrow from Thucydides, the weak will suffer as they must. As Hamas views neither Israeli nor Arab civilians as protected, there appears few other options. To return to the Indian Wars, when the men of the tribes could no longer protect their families, the war was over. The use of reservations was, at the time, the far more humanitarian option than others until that point. An indigenous population resisting multi-generational settlers could expect slavery or extermination previous to that. Hard to see through our 21st century lens, but that is the historical record. With this, I'm going to stop talking about insurgencies. If you haven't learned your lesson, much like my government and military, well, I can't help you. So next week, I will return as promised to the North African campaign of World War II, where everyone wore a uniform, the battlefield was well defined, the civilians largely absent from the fighting, and the generals highly overrated. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.